I found the barks 4 days after my husband's funeral, tucked behind a false panel in his workshop that only I knew existed because I was the one who helped him build it 30 years ago. Inside was a single sheet of yellow legal paper in Tom's handwriting, the same neat block letters he used to label every key in his shop, and it said, "Ellie, do not trust them, save yourself." I didn't fully understand it then. I understand it now. Every month when $1,200 is automatically withdrawn from my granddaughter's paycheck and funneled into an account that fuels a mobile dental clinic rolling through the streets of the neighborhood she abandoned. The van has a custom decal on both sides that reads Involuntary Founding Sponsor, Jessica Landry, and her name is right there in 3-inch gold lettering for everyone who lines up for a free cleaning to see. The judgment was for $195,000 plus 8% statutory interest, and the garnishment order ensures that every single penny lands exactly where her broken promises belong. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 61 years old, and for 40 of those years I was the bookkeeper for Vance Lock and Key, the small business my husband Tom ran out of a converted garage on Clover Street in Rosemont. I could spot a single-digit transposition on a 12-column general ledger in under 3 seconds, and I never once bounced a reconciliation. That attention to detail didn't just keep our lights on. It taught me how to follow a paper trail until it confessed every sin its creator tried to hide, and that skill became the only weapon I needed when my own blood tried to bury me. Tom was a locksmith by trade but a quiet architect of security by nature, a man who believed that every lock in the world had 2 sides, the one that kept honest people safe and the one that a determined person could learn to open if they understood the mechanism well enough. He taught me everything he knew, not because he thought I'd need it, but because he said a partnership meant neither person kept secrets. We didn't have children of our own, but we raised my granddaughter Jessica from the time she was 6 months old after my daughter, her mother, walked out of a gas station in Nevada and never came back. Jessica was the sun our little world orbited around. I taught her to balance a checkbook at 9 and sewed her Halloween costumes until she was too cool for them, and I still remember the way she'd sit on Tom's workbench and hand him small screwdrivers while he explained the difference between a wafer tumbler and a pin tumbler. I gave her every dollar of my spare attention for 23 years, and I never once doubted that she loved us back. That's the single fact that pays off later. I knew exactly who I'd been told she was, and I never once questioned it until I had no choice. Tom died on a Tuesday in April, a massive coronary while he was rekeying the filing cabinets at the county courthouse. The paramedics said he was gone before he hit the floor. I spent the next 72 hours in a fog so thick I couldn't remember if I'd eaten or what time the sun set. The funeral was a blur of sympathetic handshakes and casserole dishes from neighbors who'd known us for decades. I remember the pastor saying something about a life well lived and thinking that Tom's life deserved a more precise eulogy, something with torque tolerances and shear line measurements, but I couldn't find the words. And then the vultures started circling before the sympathy cards had even been opened. Jessica showed up at my front door on the 3rd day with Mark, her new husband of less than a year, a glossy real estate agent who wore loafers without socks and talked about curating experiences instead of selling houses. Jessica rushed to hug me, her blonde hair pressed against my cheek, and she sobbed the right kind of sobs while Mark stood behind her with a calculated sympathy in his eyes that I was too numb to register as anything but support. They said they were there to handle things, to manage the estate, to protect me from the paperwork. Jessica called me Gran and held my hand and told me I didn't have to think about a single thing. Mark mentioned, almost offhand, that he'd heard Tom had a substantial life insurance policy and that it could be a real blessing in a time like this, a way to honor his legacy. I nodded vaguely, and they exchanged a glance I didn't catch until weeks later when I replayed it in my memory like a surveillance tape. I let them into the house, and I let them start sorting through Tom's papers because I could barely stand without my knees threatening to buckle. The next morning I wandered into Tom's workshop looking for some anchor of him in the middle of all that absence. The air still smelled like machine oil and brass shavings, and the tools were still laid out in the order he'd left them. I was running my fingers along the pegboard where he hung his key-cutting equipment when I remembered the small hideaway we'd built behind the lower cabinet. Tom had designed it as a test of his own skill, a magnetic release panel triggered by pushing a specific sequence of 3 screws that looked decorative but acted as spring-loaded pins. The screws were ordinary brass flatheads, but if you pushed them in the right order and depth, a hidden cam rotated and released a small hinged door. He'd shown me the sequence while we were both covered in sawdust, laughing about how we were the only 2 people in the world who'd ever know it existed. I depressed them in that order, left, center, right, and the false back panel swung open on a tiny silent hinge. Inside sat a small fireproof box with a simple wafer lock, the kind you could pop with a paperclip if you knew what you were doing. I didn't even need to pick it. The key was still in a magnetic case stuck to the underside of the shelf above. Tom had left it accessible for me. I opened the box. Inside were a few old bonds, the deed to a small parcel of land we'd bought decades ago near the lake, and that yellow paper with Tom's handwriting. I read it 3 times before my brain could process the words. Do not trust them. Save yourself. The letters were measured and calm, as if he'd written it during a quiet afternoon with full clarity about what he was saying. I was still holding it when Jessica walked in. She glanced at the box with zero curiosity and said, "Gran, that's just Dad's old junk. Let me toss that for you." She reached for the box, and I let her take it without protest because I'd already slipped the note into my sweater pocket. She walked the whole thing to the trash bin by the side door and dropped it in. She didn't even open the lid to see what was inside. I waited until she was back inside on her phone, arranging something with a low voice, before I retrieved the box and hid it in my own closet beneath the winter blankets. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that trust without verification is just a prettier word for betrayal. Jessica and Mark didn't waste a single day. That evening they sat me down at the kitchen table with a pot of tea Mark had brewed, chamomile with a dab of honey, the sort of thoughtful gesture that felt warm until you replayed it later and realized how deliberate every placement of the mug was. Jessica took my hand and told me she'd been thinking about her future and how she could repay everything Tom and I had done for her. She wanted to become a dentist, she said. She had the acceptance letter to a prestigious dental school 4 hours away, but the tuition was staggering. She needed $135,000 for the full 4 years, and she'd been so worried she couldn't tell me earlier because she didn't want to add to my grief. Mark nodded solemnly and mentioned that Tom's life insurance policy, the one they'd heard about from some old paperwork, could be put to meaningful use. I felt the folded note in my pocket pressing against my hip like a warning signal. Instead of stiffening, I let my shoulders slump. I blinked slowly and said, "Oh, sweetheart, that's a lot to think about right now. My head is just so foggy." I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue. Jessica leaned in and said she'd take care of everything. All I needed to do was sign the check over to her educational trust, and she absolutely promised, she would come back after graduation and open a practice right here in Rosemont, our little town, where the median income barely cracked $30,000 and the nearest dentist was a 40-minute drive away. She swore she'd provide me free care for the rest of my life. "It's what Grandpa would have wanted," she whispered. I nodded like a confused old woman and said I'd need a day to think about it. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my small desk and drafted a document on my old desktop computer using a legal template I found in a folder of estate planning forms Tom and I had updated years ago. But I didn't just clone the template. I went through my mental encyclopedia of every financial contract I'd ever read for the business and added teeth. The promissory note specified the principal amount of $135,000, a fixed repayment term commencing immediately upon graduation, 0 interest as a gesture of family goodwill, but it also contained a confession of judgment clause, which is a legal mechanism that allows the holder of the note to obtain an immediate judgment in court without a trial if the borrower defaults. I typed in a liquidated damages provision that converted the entire unpaid balance to a flat sum of $195,000 in the event of breach, a figure I calculated by compounding the lost benefit of the promised free dental care over my expected remaining lifespan, using an actuarial table I found online. I pulled the Social Security life expectancy tables to make the math defensible. I also added a cross-default provision tied to any failure to establish practice in Rosemont within 12 months of licensure, a geographical covenant that would become the tripwire she never saw coming. I printed it on the old dot matrix printer Tom kept for invoices because it used carbon paper, and I wanted a physical copy that couldn't be trivially edited on a computer. The pins bit into the paper with that satisfying mechanical bite. The next afternoon I told Jessica I'd do it. I cried, I fumbled for words, I played the part of a grieving grandmother willing to give anything to see her granddaughter succeed. Mark produced the insurance check transfer form, and I signed it with a trembling hand. Then I said, "Sweetie, there's just one little thing. My accountant says we need a formal note for the IRS since the amount is so large. It's just a formality, you know how the government gets." I slid the promissory note across the table. Jessica glanced at it, barely scanning the first few lines, and laughed. "Gran, this is so you, all this paperwork." She signed it with a flourish and passed it to Mark, who signed as a witness. She called it a sentimental gesture, folded her copy, and tucked it into her purse without reading another word. I could see the edge of her signature on the carbon paper underneath, still wet. I deposited the life insurance proceeds, wired the full sum to Jessica's educational trust account, and stood at the bank counter with a receipt that felt like the weight of a gravestone. She left for dental school the next week. I stayed in Rosemont and watched the mailbox for 4 years, telling myself the note in Tom's handwriting was just the paranoia of an older man who'd seen too many hard families. Maybe I'd misinterpreted it. Maybe love would be enough. It wasn't. Jessica graduated 3rd in her class. She passed her boards on the first attempt. She posted a photo of herself holding her diploma with a caption that said, "All my hard work paid off, no shortcuts, just hustle." She didn't mention Tom or me. She didn't call. I waited 3 weeks after her licensure before dialing her number, and a robotic message told me the number had been disconnected. I found her new number through a cousin, and when I called, Mark answered. He said Jessica was incredibly busy with a new position at Radiant Smiles, a high-end cosmetic dentistry chain in a wealthy suburb called Ashton Hills, and that she'd reach out when things settled. Then he blocked my number. I drove up to Ashton Hills 2 days later. The Radiant Smiles office was a sleek glass building with a waterfall in the lobby and valet parking for patients. I walked in wearing my best Sunday coat and asked the receptionist if I could speak with Dr. Landry. I was told she was in a consultation. I waited for 3 hours until Jessica finally emerged, and when she saw me, her face didn't flinch into guilt or sadness. It hardened into annoyance. She pulled me into an empty exam room and told me in a clipped, professional tone that the promissory note was a sentimental gesture with no legal weight, that she'd never actually promised to practice in Rosemont because Rosemont was a dead-end town with no clientele who could afford anything beyond basic cleanings, and that I should be proud of her success instead of trying to drag her back. She said she'd honor the free care promise by mailing me an electric toothbrush and a year's supply of whitening strips. Then she told me to leave before she called security. I walked out of that glass building and sat in my car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, and then I drove straight to the office of Calloway and Stern, the estate attorney who'd handled Tom's will. I was done playing hurt. I was ready to play smart. But Jessica called me the next day with a completely different tone. She was crying softly, apologizing for being overwhelmed, blaming Mark's influence. She said she wanted to make things right, and that she and Mark wanted me to come live with them in Ashton Hills so they could take care of me. It was such a sharp reversal that my internal alarms lit up like a switchboard. I remembered Tom's note and said yes. I wanted to know what they were so desperate to hide. The invitation was not about care. It was about control. They put me in a small guest bedroom on the ground floor of their 5-bedroom McMansion, a house that had a 3-car garage, a pool, and furniture that still smelled of off-gassing chemicals. Within the first week, I understood that Jessica and Mark had built their image on a scaffolding of debt so precarious that a single missed payment would bring it all down. I heard Mark pacing in the hall at 2 in the morning, his voice low and frantic through the phone, saying things like, "I told you we'd have the funds by Friday. The deal just needs to close. You can't call the note yet. We'll be upside down on the boat too." I saw Jessica's credit card bills stacked in the recycling bin, zeros trailing like afterthoughts, balances that topped 40, 60, 80,000 across multiple issuers. One envelope was from a collection agency marked "Final Notice" for a cosmetic surgery loan they'd taken out on a whim. They weren't managing. They were drowning, and they needed my signature on something to stay afloat. I began my investigation the way I'd begin any audit, by listening and documenting. I kept a small notebook in my pocket and logged every unusual call, every creditor's name I overheard, every time Mark mentioned shell companies or offshore accounts. I used my position as a doddering old grandmother to wander into rooms and linger near open laptops without raising suspicion. No one watches the bookkeeper. That's the first rule of financial crime. The second rule is that trash never lies. Twice a week I volunteered to take the bins to the curb, and on those nights, I'd sift through the kitchen garbage and the shredder output from Mark's office. One evening, I found strips of a document that had been fed through a cross-cut shredder, little confetti strips of an account statement from a bank in the Cayman Islands. I took the pieces back to my room and spent 3 hours reassembling them with tape on the back of a cardboard sheet. The reconstructed statement showed a numbered account with a balance that had surged by $20,000 the same week I'd wired the dental school money, then been drained in small increments, many of them marked with notations like marketing expenses and consulting fees that made no sense for a dental student. It was money laundering, plain and simple, probably from some side business Mark was running. The breakthrough came one afternoon when a plumbing issue in the upstairs bathroom caused water to drip through a ceiling vent directly above Mark's home office, soaking a stack of papers on his desk. Mark and Jessica were out at some charity gala, and I called a plumber myself because I knew letting the damage sit would ruin the ceiling. The plumber, a nice kid named Derek, said he needed to cut into the drywall and that it would take a couple of hours. While he worked, I entered Mark's office to move the wet documents onto a dry surface. That's when I noticed a locked lateral filing cabinet in the corner with a high-security Medico lock, the kind Tom used to install for commercial clients who needed real protection. It was a biaxial pin tumbler design, 6 pins with false gates, a nightmare for amateurs because each pin had multiple false sets that would mislead you into thinking you'd opened the shear line when you were actually still locked. But Tom hadn't just installed that lock. He taught me to pick its exact variant as a puzzle on rainy Sunday afternoons. I went to my room, retrieved a small kit of picks and tension wrenches I'd packed when I moved in, just in case, and returned to the office. The plumber was still overhead, his music masking any ambient noise. I inserted a thin tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied gentle rotational pressure, binding the first pin stack. With a short hook pick, I lifted the pins one by one, feeling for the slight click of each shear line, reading the feedback through my fingertips the way Tom had taught me. The false gates on a Medico are tiny ledges that catch the pick and create a soft, mushy give instead of a clean snap, so you have to back off and relift each pin until you feel the hard, distinct set of the true shear. The 4th pin gave me trouble. It overset twice and I had to release tension entirely and start over, but I kept my breathing steady and my hands dry. 112 seconds later the plug turned. The lock surrendered. Inside the filing cabinet I found exactly what I needed. There was a folder labeled Rosemont Property, containing a partially completed quitclaim deed that purported to transfer the title of my home from my name to Jessica and Mark's. My signature was forged on the Granddaughter line, messy but passable to a rushed notary. Attached was a sticky note in Mark's handwriting that read, "Get her to sign the real one when she's confused with meds, or push the forged version through if she resists." There were also printouts of emails between Jessica and Mark from the week before they'd first approached me at my kitchen table, and I read them while my heart hammered. Jessica had written, "She's so wrapped up in grief she'll sign anything. We tell her the dental school story, get the insurance cash, and then once she's dependent on us we take the house too. The old woman won't know what hit her." Mark had replied, "I already have a buyer interested in the Rosemont lot. Just make sure she never speaks to a lawyer." I photographed every page with my phone, including the timestamps and metadata. I left the office exactly as I'd found it, relocked the cabinet, and sat in my room with the door closed while my hands trembled not from fear, but from what I can only describe as a sudden, clarifying fury. Tom had seen this coming. Tom had warned me, and now I had the evidence that would dismantle their entire scheme at the molecular level. The next step was the ally I already had, Henry Calloway, the estate attorney. I met him at a diner 3 towns over and laid out the promissory note, the forged deed, the emails, and the timeline. Henry listened, removed his glasses, and told me something that changed the shape of everything. He said that Tom, about 18 months before his death, had come to him with a very specific concern. Tom had noticed certain behaviors in Jessica, small cruelties that he never shared with me because he didn't want to poison my love for her unless he had proof. He'd asked Henry to draft a springing trust that would activate only if a documented family loan went into default, and if evidence of intentional fraud was presented. The trust was tied to my identity and my physical presence, meaning no one could access its enforcement mechanisms without me voluntarily agreeing, and it gave the trustee the power to file an expedited confession of judgment and immediately seek a wage garnishment order without the usual 30-day waiting period. Tom had essentially built a dead man's switch into our estate. Henry handed me a sealed envelope that Tom had left with him, and I opened it there at the diner. Inside was a short letter in Tom's handwriting that read, "Ellie, if you're reading this, I was right. Don't bend. The lock is yours to turn. I love you." Below that, he'd drawn a tiny diagram of the Medico pin stacks, as if to remind me that I already knew how to open anything that was put in front of me. Henry told me. Your husband made sure that if she ever tried to bleed you dry, the knife would snap back in her hand. All you have to do is say the word. I said the word. Henry filed the lawsuit the next business day. He also put me in touch with a compliance investigator from the State Dental Board, a woman named Sandra Okonkwo who specialized in fraud cases. I met her at a coffee shop and walked her through the forged quitclaim deed and the scheme to steal my house. She told me that using a notary stamp in connection with a forged document was a direct violation of the Dental Practice Act and could trigger an immediate suspension of Jessica's license pending review. She asked if I'd be willing to gather one more piece of evidence if possible, a direct link between the forgery and Jessica's professional stationery or office resources. I told her I'd do what I could. While the legal machinery began its quiet churning, I staged a test of my own. I needed to know if there was any molecule of genuine humanity left in Jessica, not for sentimental reasons, but because the success of the coming confrontation depended on timing, and I couldn't afford last-minute hesitation. I chose a Friday afternoon when Mark was out showing properties, and Jessica was home reviewing patient files. I walked into the kitchen where she was sitting at the island with a latte and her tablet, and I clutched my chest. I let out a strangled gasp, dropped to my knees and fell sideways onto the tile floor with a thud that I knew sounded convincing because I'd seen Tom collapse exactly that way. I lay there, eyes half closed, breathing shallowly. I could feel the cold seeping through the tile, and I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. Jessica looked up from her tablet. She stared at me for a full 4 seconds, her face utterly blank. Then she said quietly, "You couldn't have picked a worse time," and stepped over my body to retrieve her purse from the counter. She pulled out a document I couldn't see clearly, folded it into her jacket, and walked out the front door without calling an ambulance, without checking my pulse, without a single backward glance. The door clicked shut and I heard her car start in the driveway. I lay on the cold tile for 3 more minutes before getting up, and I didn't cry. I just added one more line to the mental ledger where I'd been tallying every betrayal. That night I searched her tablet when she was in the shower and found the document she'd taken. It was a final draft of the quitclaim deed, now notarized with her own office seal, ready for filing. I photographed it and sent it to Sandra Okonkwo at the dental board. The trap was set. The legal process moved with a speed that surprised even Henry. Because of the confession of judgment clause and the pre-existing trust Tom had engineered, the court granted an expedited entry of judgment for $195,000 plus statutory interest at 8%, accruing daily. The order for wage garnishment was signed by a judge after we submitted the promissory note, the emails proving fraudulent intent, and the forged deed as evidence of an ongoing scheme. The garnishment order directed Radiant Smiles' payroll department to deduct 25% of Jessica's disposable earnings each month until the judgment was satisfied, which at her associate dentist's salary came out to roughly $1,200 per cycle. I received a certified copy of the order on a Thursday morning and placed it in a manila envelope along with the recorded phone call I'd made of her stepping over me and a printout of the Cayman Islands' reassembled statement. The confrontation was the final act, and I designed it to be surgical. 3 days after the garnishment order was served to her employer, but before Jessica had yet checked her work email, Mark cornered me in the living room with a notary public he'd brought to the house, a nervous young man who clearly thought he was there for a routine refinancing. Jessica stood beside him with a rehearsed look of concern. Mark said they needed me to sign a simple document to help them refinance the house, something about an equity consolidation. He slid a multi-page document across the coffee table, and I recognized the Rosemont quitclaim deed embedded on page 7. He'd buried it. He thought I'd be too cloudy to read. I smiled, picked up the pen, and set it back down. "I'm not signing anything today," I said, "but you are about to sign something. In fact, you already signed it years ago. I'm just here to watch the ink dry." Jessica's mask slipped. "What are you talking about, Gran?" I stood up, pulled my phone from my pocket, and pressed play on a recording I'd made of her stepping over me in the kitchen. Her own voice filled the room. "You couldn't have picked a worse time." Mark's hand froze on the notary's shoulder. Then I said, "The promissory note you called a sentimental gesture had a confession of judgment. You defaulted the moment you took that job in Ashton Hills. The court awarded me $195,000 plus interest, and a garnishment order went into effect this morning. 25% of every paycheck you earn from Radiant Smiles will be redirected to an account I control, and I've already decided where that money is going." I opened the manila envelope and spread the papers on the table, the judgment, the garnishment order, the forged deed, the emails, and the reconstructed Cayman Islands statement. You've been laundering money through an offshore account, you forged my signature to steal my home, and you were planning to have me declared incompetent so you could take everything. You stepped over what you thought was my dying body to grab a piece of paper that proves your fraud, and I've already reported you to the dental board. Mark grabbed the notary and started stammering about invalidity, forgery, claims of undue influence. He said they'd sue me, that I was a crazy old woman, that no court would uphold a document signed under duress. I looked at the notary and said calmly, "You might want to leave before the authorities arrive. You've been an unwitting witness to a felony." The notary bolted. At that moment the front door opened and Sandra Okonkwo walked in, her grey suit crisp and her badge visible on a lanyard. She had a uniformed officer with her. Sandra announced that she was serving Jessica with a formal notice of investigation for professional misconduct, and that her dental license was being suspended effective immediately pending a full review. She also stated that the forged quitclaim deed, notarized with Jessica's official seal, constituted a criminal act, and she was being detained for questioning. Jessica started screaming about how I'd tricked her, how I'd never been the sweet grandmother she remembered, how she'd been set up. I picked up my purse and walked past her toward the door. I paused next to her and said, "You're right, Jessica, I'm not the sweet grandmother you remember. I'm the one who taught you how to balance a checkbook, and I just balanced yours. Every debit you ever made against my love just got reconciled." I left her standing there with her mouth open and her entire world collapsing into the paperwork she'd never bothered to read. Now let me tell you about the mobile clinic, because that's the part of this story that matters most. The first month's garnishment came through exactly on schedule, and I deposited it into a dedicated account I'd opened with a local credit union under the name Rosemont Community Dental Fund. I contacted a company in Ohio that modifies cargo vans into medical units, and within 6 weeks I had a fully outfitted dental coach with a chair, sterilizer, suction lines, and a digital X-ray system. I hired a retired dentist, Dr. Helen Chow, who'd spent her career in community health and wanted to spend her later years serving the underserved. We mapped out a route through Rosemont and the surrounding neighborhoods, stopping at community centers, church parking lots, and public housing complexes every Tuesday and Thursday. Services are free for anyone without insurance, and we charge a sliding scale of $5 for anyone else, which mostly covers fuel and supplies. The first day we opened, 67 people showed up, and a woman named Mrs. Patterson cried in the chair because she'd been living with an abscessed tooth for 11 months and had been unable to afford the extraction fee anywhere else. She told me she'd been praying for a miracle, and I told her the miracle had a court docket number. I had a sign company print 2 large decals for the vehicle. On each side, in gold lettering that catches the sun, it says, "This mobile clinic is funded entirely through voluntary contributions and the court-ordered wages of Dr. Jessica Landry, involuntary founding sponsor." Underneath is a small line, a promise kept that she refused to honor. Her name is permanently affixed to the thing she tried to escape, and every mile that van rolls through the town she abandoned is a mile she pays for. Last Tuesday, a local news crew came out and did a segment on the clinic. The reporter asked me what I thought Jessica would say if she saw it, and I said, "I don't care what she says. I care that a 12-year-old boy named Marcus got a cavity filled for the first time in his life, without his mother having to choose between his teeth and the electric bill." That segment went online, and now people from 3 counties over send donations just so they can say they contributed to the van with her name on it. Jessica lost her job at Radiant Smiles 3 weeks after the dental board opened their investigation. The chain doesn't tolerate even the appearance of fraud on a provider's record. She's now working at a strip mall dental clinic that processes Medicaid patients in bulk, and the garnishment follows her there too, because the order is attached to her social security number, not her employer. Mark's real estate license is under review because of the forged deed, and they sold the McMansion in a short sale that barely covered their primary mortgage. They rent a 2-bedroom apartment now, and last I heard, Jessica's car was repossessed in the middle of the night while they both stood in the parking lot in their robes. I don't feel satisfaction exactly, but I do feel a sort of clean, quiet completion, like a ledger that finally balances after years of hidden entries. Tom's note sits in a frame on my desk in the small apartment I rented back in Rosemont. I look at it every morning before I head out to the clinic van. He wrote, "Save yourself," and that's exactly what I did, not by running or hiding but by following the paper trail until it led me back to the truth he'd already seen. He set the deadbolt. I just had to turn the key. And every time that van pulls up and I see those gold letters glinting in the sun, I know that the inheritance Tom left me wasn't money. It was the knowledge that a well-designed mechanism will always outlast a well-practiced lie. The lesson I've taken from all of this is simple. Love without documentation is faith, but faith doesn't hold up in court. When family asks for everything, make sure you leave a paper trail that can survive them. And never, ever let someone else write your story into their signature line. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. If you believe that trust is earned in deeds, not words, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of real-life justice. I'll be back with another one soon.